Hello guys, Ancient Gameplays, I'm Fabio Pisco and welcome to my channel. And finally, after several weeks, we are now bringing another GPU comparison, this time with the RX 7900 XTX versus the RTX 4080 Super. And this because NVIDIA sent me some time ago the RTX 4080 Super that you can see in 40 games tested at 4K, and 40 games tested at 1440p will come as well, and you can see it for example on the unboxing video, and more videos like this one will come as well with overclocking and undervolting and some others. And NVIDIA also sent the RTX 4070 Super and the 4070 Ti Super, so more tests will come regarding those scenarios. I also want to thank AMD for sending the 7900 XT card that I did not have to stay permanently in the channel, and the 7900 GRE Nitro Plus. Thing that I will test, it is actually there. You can see the three cards there. The GRE is the middle one, and I'll actually test the GRE in order to see the new overclocking and so on. But for now, we have the 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super. And speaking of Super, I immediately remembered what? Today's sponsor.
Today's sponsor is Maximum Settings, a cloud-based gaming service where you won't need to spend thousands of dollars to upgrade your PC or a personal nuclear plant to boot up your system.
Just do it!
And for as low as 9.95 Canadian dollars a month, you can play the most recent games on your computer even if your hardware isn't prepared. Sign up today for your full Linux gaming PC with no resource sharing and start enjoying high-level gaming on any PC.
And as usual, before going to the benchmarks, let's talk a bit about pricing. The RTX 4080 Super can be found on Newegg US at $101,029, and MSI is now on a campaign where you actually have $50 off, so even the top tier models will cost more or less this, so $1,129, and the RX 7900 XTX costs roughly $899. Which is almost $250 less than the RTX 4080 Super, price difference that can get you several other hardware components with that price, like a better CPU, more RAM, a better NVMe or a new NVMe, and so on. As for the European prices, we have the RTX 4080 Super costing around 1,083 euros, this on Mind Factory Dutchland, and then we have the RX 7900 XTX costing around 949 euros. So as you can see, the price will vary depending on where you live. For example, in US, the price difference is usually in between $200 and $250, which is quite a lot. So with this in mind, which card should you get? The RTX 4080 Super or the RX 7900 XTX? So let's find out.
He's going to catch us! Keep running!
So today we start with Plague Tale Requiem, and this is one of those games where the NVIDIA GPUs tend to perform better. I mean, after all this time the studio still didn't even implement FSR, but I guess that's a different story. As for the results, the RTX 4080 Super is still slightly faster at 1080p, as can be seen, but at 1440p the difference in between both cards is only 4 FPS, which is something really small here, with the biggest difference being in the 1% lows, where the 4080 Super is 9% faster. At 4K, the RX 7900 XTX manages to outperform the RTX 4080 Super, or at least match it, but of course while consuming much more power, as even in the side-by-side comparisons at 1080p you can see that the difference in between both cards tweaked is quite a lot, with the RTX 4080 Super pulling around 100 watts less. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, the power consumption difference is around 120 watts at 1080p, but around 150 watts at 4K. As for the results, we have both cards performing more or less the same at 1080p, with a small CPU bottleneck, and at 1440p the RX 7900 XTX starts losing some ground, being now slightly slower than the RTX 4080, thing that gets undone again at 4K, where both cards are now virtually on par performance-wise, being the only difference the amount of power used. And we all know Cyberpunk 2077 is NVIDIA's poster child, but RDNA 3 cards tend to perform considerably well in this game apart from ray tracing, as can be seen here at 1080p. At 1440p the RX 7900 XTX gets a bigger advantage over the RTX 4080 Super, but nothing really groundbreaking, being the only noticeable difference at 4K, where the RX 7900 XTX is 9% faster than the RTX 4080 Super. And in terms of low FPS output, the difference from 76 to 82 can be noticed by some people. Definitely. And Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is the only game so far where, although the RX 7900 XTX consumes a lot more power, it also delivers way more performance, being in this case 35% faster than the RTX 4080 Super, which is a massive performance difference. At 1440p this still applies, with the RX 7900 XTX delivering 51 FPS more, which in this case translates into a 32% performance uplift that can be easily seen by anyone using a high refresh rate panel. And even at 4K, where the difference is quite smaller, the AMD card still takes the lead, showing us that it is still 26% faster, delivering a much more enjoyable experience. With Forza Horizon 5, we can see the AMD card pulling ahead once again, in this case due to the massive performance uplift it has with smart access memory. At 1440p those uplifts are still there, and the RX 7900 XTX is still faster, but not by much of course. And at 4K we have more or less the same here, so the RX 7900 XTX is a bit faster, but the RX 4080 Super consumes way less power. And speaking of power, Hogwarts Legacy loves raw power, and this is why we see the AMD cards constantly beating the NVIDIA counterparts in terms of rasterization, although losing in ray tracing of course, but we'll get there. At 1440p the difference gets bigger, and the RX 7900 XTX delivers considerably better numbers, being 18% faster than the RTX 4080 Super, which is not something that you see in every game. And as you go to 4K the difference is big. Anyone with functioning high sight could see the difference in between 67 and 86 FPS smoothness wise, and this is where the AMD card strives, being 28% faster, with the RTX 4080 Super somehow losing performance versus stock. And in case you don't know, Microsoft Flight Simulator is one of those games where the AMD cards were better if you were talking about RDNA 2 versus Ampere, but with Ada Lovelace GPUs, well, they are considerably better in this title, possibly due to the improved L2 cache. At 1080p we get into a CPU bottleneck most times, something that still happens in most scenarios at 1440p. So it is only when we go to 4K that we can see the real GPU benchmarks, and even here the results are more or less on par with each other, with the RX 7900 XTX winning by 3 FPS, which is nothing. Alan Wake 2 is another heavily sponsored title, and yet the RX 7900 XTX is still faster here, especially due to the smart access memory performance boost that makes this card 11% faster than the RTX 4080 Super at 1080p. At 1440p the difference gets way smaller, and the NVIDIA card basically matches the AMD one with a much lower power draw, while also having higher 1% lows usually. And at 4K the tables turn, and the RTX 4080 Super is now faster than the RX 7900 XTX, in this case by 5%. once again while consuming less power. But well, it is also more expensive, so it's a trade-off, I guess. Now, I know that people tend to say that they don't care much about ray tracing, and that's actually fine. I personally don't use it much as well, even with my NVIDIA cards, but we do need to understand that as time passes by, more and more games will start getting released with some kind of ray tracing implementation always enabled, like we see in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. And in these case scenarios, the NVIDIA cards are considerably faster, like the RTX 4080 Super, that is 15% faster here at 1080p. Difference that stays at 1440p, but with the NVIDIA card also delivering higher 1% lows, which is nice. Although it is at 4K that the difference stands out a bit more, with the AMD card delivering 64 FPS versus the 73 with the NVIDIA one, which is of course a 14% difference, but in terms of gameplay smoothness, it can be really noticed if you're using, for example, a FreeSync or G-Sync panel, so that makes a difference. And Starfield is one of the most interesting tests that I've made because even though the game is sponsored by AMD and doesn't feature ray tracing at all, the RTX 4080 Super is still slightly faster, even at 1080p. At 1440p both cards perform virtually the same in terms of averages, of course, but the RX 7900 XTX does deliver higher 1% lows, indicating a smoother experience. And funny enough, these results get maintained at 4K, where the averages are the same with both cards, but with the AMD one delivering higher 1% lows. Interesting. The Last of Us is one of those games where AMD absolutely needs smart access memory, and sadly they took some time to implement it in this game, but as soon as they did, the performance issues were basically fixed, as can be seen here at 1080p. At 1440p the CPU bottleneck goes away mostly, and now the RX 7900 XTX is 10% faster than the RTX 4080 Super, which shows how important SAM implementation is in some games. And at 4K, the difference is there as well, with the AMD card still being 10% faster, which is nothing hugely relevant, but still quite nice for a card costing $200 less. As for God of War, it is another one of those titles that loves raw power, especially bandwidth, and that can be seen here once again with the RX 7900 XTX delivering 27 FPS more than the RTX 4080 Super, even in a CPU-bound scenario. As we raise the resolution to 1440p, things get more or less on par with what we expected before, with the XTX now being 14% faster, and the higher the resolution gets, the bigger the difference is as well, with the RX 7900 XTX being 15% faster than the RTX 4080 Super at 1440p ultra-wide in this title. As for the average results, we can see that these cards are more or less on par overall. Maybe if we didn't count Avatar, for example, the RX 7900 XTX would be a bit faster. But even with things that way, the AMD card is 4% faster at 1080p, 6% faster at 1440p, and 8% faster at 4K. Being this one the really relevant difference in my point of view, with the RTX 4080 Super consuming way less power, but with the RX 7900 XTX being faster in Rasterization and costing quite less. And now that we've seen the Rasterization results, let's see the ray tracing ones.
We're not from here either. Stellantis locked us up here a year ago.
The first ray tracing benchmark is with Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, which is a full ray tracing game, so in case you don't know, you can't even run it unless your GPU supports hardware ray tracing. As for the results, we can see right away how much faster the RTX 4080 Super is, in this case 26% faster at 1080p, 35% faster at 1440p, which is already a big difference, and 39% faster at 4K. Although we must give some credit to AMD in this one thing: smoothness. If you look at the 1% lows at both 1080p and 1440p, they're much higher on the RX 7900 XTX. So even though we have considerably lower averages, the gameplay smoothness was also better. As we go to Cyberpunk 2077 though, well, it's like seeing a guy kicking someone that has been dead for a week. At 1080p, the RTX 4080 Super is 54% faster than the RX 7900 XTX natively and 34% faster when using FSR/DLSS. And this is not even the worst case scenario. At 1440p, the RTX 4080 Super is 52% faster natively and 53% faster with FSR/DLSS. And even though the native difference is the same as before, percentage-wise, we're talking about going from 46 to 71 FPS, and any gamer knows that in terms of gameplay smoothness, that's night and day, with the RX 7900 XTX barely delivering more FPS with FSR than the RTX 4080 Super does at native 1440p. But gladly, as we go into Resident Evil 4, the differences are much lower, as the game's implementation is also lighter, or softer, let's call it that. At 1080p, the AMD card is now slower in both scenarios, while the normal 4080 was actually a bit slower than the RX 7900 XTX here, and at 1440p you'd think things would be different, but the NVIDIA card is still delivering the best results here, having almost no FPS drop when using ray tracing. And the exact same thing applies to 1440p ultra-wide, where the AMD card is virtually on par in terms of rasterization, but slower in terms of ray tracing. Gladly, the difference is actually quite small in this title. And the same applies to Spider-Man Remastered, that puts a lot of ray tracing workload to the CPU as well. And here we start at 1440p, as with 1080p we would be almost 100% CPU bottlenecked. But even at 1440p, you can see that the results are very close with or without ray tracing. And the same applies to 4K, where impressively the RX 7900 XTX does actually a job of course, but a good job, and delivers only 5 FPS less than the RTX 4080 Super when using ray tracing, thing that wouldn't be really noticeable in real gameplay scenarios, which is good for the AMD side. The last ray tracing game is Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and oh man, we got another big difference here. At 1080p, the RX 7900 XTX was actually faster without ray tracing, but as soon as we enable it, the RTX 4080 Super is 33% faster in the averages and 104% faster in the 1% lows. I'm even stuttering, because yes, it's more than double the 1% lows. At 1440p things get a little bit harder for the AMD card, that now drops below the 100 average FPS mark, when using ray tracing of course, but it still delivers a playable experience even without FSR. The RTX 4080 Super is still quite faster, but nothing really astonishing here as it was at 1080p. And since I mentioned FSR and DLSS before, let's see how these cards fare when using those.
Members of the Resistance, report to your nearest...
Ratchet & Clank is once again on the upscaling benchmarks, as it features FSR, DLSS and XeSS, which altogether could actually be the best 2024 boys band. At 4K you can see that this game actually has some issues with upscaling. I tested several GPUs, and it happens the same with almost every single one of them, where in most scenarios we have lower 1% lows than native when using FSR, DLSS or XeSS, which is a bummer if you ask me. And to finalize, we have Spider-Man Remastered once again, with things being quite linear here as they were before. Although, if we take a look at it, the RX 7900 XTX doesn't really like XeSS in this game at all, as it delivers almost the same results as native resolution. While the RTX 4080 Super has less FPS with XeSS than DLSS, of course, but XeSS does deliver a decent boost over native resolution. And overall, these are the results I have with all cards on this game, with the NVIDIA ones running XeSS better than their NVIDIA counterparts, their AMD counterparts, sorry. So with this all said and done, let's move to the final thoughts.
And well guys, as for the final thoughts, well, if we compare both cards, the 4080 Super with the 7900 XTX, both have their best things or their good things and their bad things. The 7900 XTX, for example, costs way less than the RTX 4080 Super and still performs better in terms of rasterization. On the other hand, if we go to ray tracing, it performs worse in terms of ray tracing, and at the same time it consumes a lot more power. A lot more power. In most scenarios you can get, for example, the XTX going up to 450 watts. Not this version because this is the reference version, but usually, and we are doing actually reference versus reference, an AIB model from the XTX can go easily up to 450 watts. Even with the reference version going as high as 400, in most scenarios the RTX 4080 Super tweaked will stay below the 300 watts mark, usually going to 320 watts in really heavy games, usually at 4K. But anything besides that, it will be usually below the 300 watts mark, while the 7900 XTX is usually all the time over the 350 watts mark, if, once again, we are playing tweaked versus tweaked. So once again, the XTX is much cheaper, definitely much cheaper, performs better in rasterization, but once again has way higher power draw. And, well, for the moment, before FSR 3.1, the FSR is still way inferior compared to the DLSS in 90% of scenarios, and frame generation is still across several games for now, while on the AMD side we still only have some games, let's say like 20 games with frame generation, and sadly some recent implementations have been broken, like the one in The Last of Us, Robocop, and so on. I don't really know if that's an AMD thing or developer thing, like I showed for example on this video passing right now on the screen, but it is happening and we should take that in consideration. As for the RTX 4080 Super, once again, the DLSS is better, frame generation is working fine and across many games, many more games, and at the same time it consumes way less power, ranging in between 100 and 150 watts difference. So we're talking about a whole GPU bracket in terms of power draw difference. Once again, the RTX 4080 Super usually stays below the 300 watts when overclocked and undervolted, while the XTX usually goes always above 350, so that's it. But one more time, it has better features, performs better in ray tracing, but performs slightly worse in terms of rasterization and costs much more. So it all comes to what you want. If you want a cheaper product that still has lots of features and, well, consumes a bit more power, but in terms of raw performance it is better, then the 7900 XTX is the way to go, because you can get an XTX and get, for example, the 7800X 3D and plus another NVMe instead of getting, for example, the 4080 Super with, let's say, a 7700X or an Intel equivalent, let's say that. On the RTX 4080 Super combo, you have a better GPU, let's say a better GPU overall, because it is a better GPU overall if we consider everything, but on the XTX you have a cheaper GPU that can lead you to get a better CPU or more or better parts for your computer. So it's a trade-off. As for my opinion, if I wanted to get a better CPU combo, a better overall combo, I would go with the XTX. If ray tracing was really important for me and I really wanted frame generation to be working in almost every game, especially the recent games, and I wanted the card performing really well at a lower power draw, then the RTX 4080 Super would be the way to go. And well guys, that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe and share this video, as that really helps a lot. And I guess see you in the next one, guys, in which I will be talking a bit about how you can fix the recent FSR 3 implementation, especially the Robocop one. There are already fixes and it makes the game perform much smoother. Thank you very much once again and see you in the next one, guys. Cheers.